This lecture is about photosynthesis and respiration. First thing we're going to look at is photosynthesis. So what I'm going to do is draw a picture here. I'm going to draw a plant cell, big, okay, plant cell. And then what we want to do is draw a disproportionately large chloroplast just so that we can draw the images on the inside of it to see what's going on. All right, and then inside of the chloroplast there are two locations that you need to know about. One is the thylakoid, and let's label that thylakoid. And it's basically membrane. So the chloroplast is a membrane, and on the inside is more membrane, and those are the thylakoids. And when they're stacked, they're called granum, but you don't need to know that term. We're just going to call them a thylakoid, okay, which is the singular. And then the other location you need to know about is the stroma, and the stroma is the fluid. It's just the cytoplasm that the thylakoid's sitting in. You can think of the stroma as like the water in the bathtub, and then the thylakoid is sitting in the bathtub. All right, so we know that plants can make carbohydrates from solar radiation, CO2, and water, and so we want to see exactly how this works. Let's go ahead and start with sunlight. So radiation from the sun is obviously going to strike the plant leaf all over, but something interesting happens when it strikes the thylakoid membrane. In the thylakoid embedded are pigments. So you've heard that term before. You've heard about things like chlorophyll A, beta carotene, and they're arranged in these clusters. So let's draw a couple of these clusters. These clusters are called photosystems, and they're designed to harness the energy of light and to convert it into chemical energy, which is really phenomenal if you think about it. What happens there are these molecules, these pigments, when sunlight strikes them, they actually get so disturbed that one of their electrons ends up being lost from a pigment. And that electron, that basically the loss of the electron is the literal chemical manifestation of the potential energy of light. So you have light energy that's striking the surface, and when it hits a pigment, the pigment molecule goes nuts basically, and the electron is lost, and now you have the chemical representation of light. So this single electron is off the charts for potential energy. And this is really what allows and what fuels the entire process of photosynthesis, is this conversion of light energy into chemical energy using pigments. So that electron has a lot of potential energy, and there are a series of reactions that occur along this arrow to harness that energy. And if you go on in biology, you will learn those specific reactions. What I want you to know is that the high potential energy in that electron is used to phosphorylate ADP. So if you remember that reaction, ADP plus a phosphate equals ATP. Okay, so we've generated energy basically from light. Okay, so that's good because, as you recall, photosynthesis is an uphill reaction. You're taking CO2 and water, rearranging those atoms into a carbohydrate. That's going to take energy, and well, this is where it comes from. So the light really provides energy. The other thing that it provides is hydrogen. So that might sound kind of odd, but let me show you what I'm talking about here. There's obviously a lot of water in the stroma, and this is going to be kind of a weird angle, but let's take our light energy and bring it over here. And let's have light strike water too. If you leave a cup out in the sun, what will happen to some of those water molecules is they'll break apart, and then when they come back together, they will produce heat. And that's an example of both an uphill and a downhill reaction, and that's happening here as well. When sunlight strikes the stroma, water molecules, some of them break into their component parts. So if you take water apart, you have two hydrogens and an oxygen. So there's the hydrogen proton, and there's its electron, and then the other hydrogen, and the single oxygen. So if this was a cup of water, that arrow goes to the right, it breaks apart, and then it would come right back together and snap back into H2O, and that would leave a burst of heat, and it would contribute to warming up that glass of water. Something very interesting that happens here, though. Because this photosystem is lacking an electron, there's a very strong pull for an electron. So this electron actually can't be used to create water anymore. And once that happens, this will never become water again. So what do you do with the rest of it? Well, hydrogen ions are actually great. They're used in creating a concentration gradient along this arrow in the reactions we aren't covering for Bio 101. So the hydrogen ion is used during these reactions. That electron went ahead and went to replace the photosystem electron. This right here is what we want, though. So I mentioned that solar radiation is used to generate a hydrogen, and that actually happens here. So I'm going to introduce to you NADP. And what NADP is it's a coenzyme. And don't think too much into this, but basically it's kind of like a buffer molecule that is able to take on hydrogen and give up hydrogen easily, okay? And so this hydrogen, proton and electron are carried by this coenzyme. So there it is. Okay, so NADP carries the hydrogen, and that's going to be used later on. The last thing we're left with is oxygen, and this is the part that I find truly remarkable about photosynthesis, is the fact that because solar radiation happens to break apart water, it leaves a free oxygen. So what happens is oxygen hooks up with other oxygens to make O2, and that diffuses out of the plant cell. So no energy is used to do that. The other thing that could happen to that O2 molecule is it could be used for aerobic respiration inside of the plant cell. So if you think about the oxygen that has built up in the atmosphere over billions of years in order to support aerobic respiring organisms, this is where it comes from. It's from water breaking apart in the stroma. Okay, so that basically is a summary of the light-dependent reactions. And those are just the reactions that require light. So the thylakoid, inside the thylakoid, generating that free electron, and then in turn generating ATP. And then the second light-dependent reaction is breaking apart water and generating a hydrogen. Oxygen truly is a byproduct. It's not something that's useful for photosynthesis. Okay. So then, where do you get a carbohydrate, right? So hopefully you're not getting lost in the process. There's something called the Calvin cycle. And this is happening in the stroma. And this is the light-independent reaction, or the dark reaction, if you've heard of that. And the inputs for the Calvin cycle are ATP, so it needs ATP. It needs hydrogen. So both of the outputs, well, two of the three outputs are used in the Calvin cycle. Oxygen is not used, but ATP and hydrogen are used. And then you need one more thing, right? So for photosynthesis, You needed water, and you needed CO2, and you needed light. So this is where CO2 comes in, and this is diffusion as well. Okay, so CO2 diffuses in and is used in that Calvin cycle. So when you think about what a carbohydrate is basically carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So if you think about where those individual atoms come from, the carbon and the oxygen come from CO2. The hydrogen comes from water. And the energy to rearrange all three of these into a carbohydrate comes from ATP. So the Calvin cycle will, its output is a carbohydrate. Okay, so that is photosynthesis at the level of Biology 101. The other thing I want to show you are the stages of cellular respiration. Okay, so there's two types of cellular respiration. There's aerobic and there's anaerobic. And even for aerobic respiring organisms like humans, we have a backup pathway and we use anaerobic respiration as well. And this right here is anaerobic respiration. It does not require a mitochondria. It happens in the cytoplasm. And essentially what it is if you have a 6-carbon sugar, it's cutting it in half so that you end up with 2 pyruvates. And the 2 pyruvates are just 2 3-carbon sugars. And that act of splitting glucose in half generates about 2 ATP. So anaerobic respiration cuts glucose in half, creates these 2 pyruvates, and since you're going from a less stable to 2 more stable molecules, you actually have a net output of 2 ATP. Okay, so if you were doing some sort of intense exercise, lifting weights, running sprints, this is what you would be doing. You'd be splitting glucose in the cytoplasm inside of your cells and creating 2 ATP. The issue here is that for humans, we produce lactate or lactic acid from these, and so when that builds up, we can get sore. We can feel sore. Now, if we have time and the energetic demand permits it, you can move these pyruvates into the Krebs cycle and get way more bang for your buck in terms of ATP. So the Krebs cycle, what it does is it essentially removes the carbon and the oxygen from these pyruvates. So, you know, if you remember what carbohydrates look like, you'll know what pyruvates look like because it's just half the carbohydrate chain, right? So if I go ahead and draw out part of this, what you can see, oops, that shouldn't be a carbon. Okay, so what you can see is that if you remove carbon and oxygens, you're going to end up with giving off this gas. So this is a byproduct for us, and what you know about CO2 is it moves through simple diffusion right into the blood and then out through the lungs, and you're left over with hydrogens. So the bottom line here is the electrons and these hydrogens are really, really, really important, and the number of hydrogens that a molecule has on it determines how much ATP you can make. So a carbohydrate is going to have fewer hydrogens than a fat. And so a fat is going to be able to produce the most ATP. And carbs will produce less ATP. Okay, so hydrogens are what we're after, and that happens here in the Krebs cycle. So we get rid of the waste, the carbon, the oxygen, and that's for fats as well. And then you take the hydrogens and you move those over to oxidative phosphorylation. And what happens here is oxygen comes in, right? We have heart, we have lungs, we have blood vessels to move oxygen into the cell into the mitochondria, and so the oxygen is actually split by enzymes. So you use your H's and your O's to produce H2O, and that is a huge downhill reaction, okay, and you're going to get a lot of ATP. So you're actually going to get around 32. So there's a range of ATP that you can get here, but this is the number we're going to use for class. So carbs will give you 36 ATP using the number of hydrogens that are being processed. Because this is such a downhill reaction, that's why you get so many ATP. A fat will give you about 129, and that's because it has more hydrogens on it to be processed through oxidative phosphorylation. Now you might ask, going back to an old lecture, I said that carbs are immediate energy use. Fats are not. Fats are long-term energy storage. So if you get more ATP from fat, why wouldn't this be our immediate energy use molecule? That's something I want you to think about, and something that we'll talk about in class. Okay, so carbs are your immediate use molecule, so you got to figure out why. Why is it that these are immediate use and these aren't when you get so many more ATP? Okay, so that concludes cellular respiration. One thing I did want to show you is this figure that you guys have in your book. You guys have these boxes filled in. What you have here is, in a plant, you have chloroplasts and mitochondria next to one another. And that should make sense to you now, because the light reactions generate oxygen that can then either go into the atmosphere or be used in oxidative phosphorylation. So plants will use some of the oxygen they generate. So it's unique that they have both of these side by side. And then remember, the Krebs cycle produces CO2. And so plants will go ahead and use that in their in the Calvin cycle in the chloroplast. Okay, and then of course this is water. So water being used in the light reactions here. Okay, so you can see some energy coupling happening here between photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, that's it for photosynthesis and respiration.